Once again, just before Christmas, I am delighted to be joined by Anna Danylchuk. I'm not going to go a huge introduction here because everybody on the channel knows Anna. I think many of you will have watched our chats from last year, our sort of marathon chats around this time of year. It's a very special time for many people. And for me, it's especially great to be able to share this moment with Anna. Today, we do something slightly different. We're not going to talk about necessarily the geopolitics of the present. We're not going to talk about what happened, what Putin said, what Trump said, blah, blah, blah. We're going to do something a little bit perhaps more personal, and we're going to dive into our personal experiences of Russia culture, etc. We've tentatively called this episode Holidays in Mordor. And I'm hoping this slightly more personal angle will be a bit more revealing about, our attitudes and our experiences of a country that has become extremely toxic in the world and extremely toxic for its neighbors, including Ukraine. Before we dive into it, I wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody who's supported the channel through the year. Everyone's become a patron, everyone's bought me a coffee, and the same for Anna. All your support for both of us helps to make this stuff happen, and it's incredibly important. And of course, thank you also to those who are helping us to get to the target of buying trucks to send to Ukraine. They're absolutely critical pieces of equipment at this time. And of course, it's going to be a big year next year as the documentary film is rolling out, and we're going to be filming the first sequences in January on that. So lots to look forward to, lots of essential work to help Ukraine. Without further ado, though, Anna, welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me to your channel and your beautiful community in such a magical moment, because I believe Christmas is a time of transition, a time to think about some truly important things, and I'm happy to discuss that with you.
Well, first we're going to dive in because Christmas, and the period around Christmas, we have slightly different ways of seeing it and celebrating different traditions in different parts of Europe and the UK and indeed Ukraine. And before we hit record, we're delighted to have a fantastic conversation, but really fascinated by what you were saying about the idea of spirits and a sort of mystical angle on Christmas, which is why this episode of Holidays in Mordor, or horror stories, let's say, about Mordor, is going to be the focus. It fits very well with, you were saying, quite a sort of mystical spiritual tradition prior to Christmas Day in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that we are talking on this very special evening. And actually, one of my favorite books, one of my favorite stories in the Ukrainian literature is by Mykola Gogol, and that is A Night Before Christmas. And I remember reading it a number of times when I was at school, and even now, this is one of those stories that you can read multiple times to get into the atmosphere. So this Night Before Christmas describes a magical evening on the eve of Christmas. And in Ukraine, we believe that this is a time when you have to be very careful because lots of evil spirits, devils are around. And typically, that's a time of long nights, blizzards, and you have to be very careful when outside, not to get frozen, not to get tempted. And there are actually lots of stories that describe weird things that may happen. And in that Gogol's story, I love the part when the devil tries to steal the moon and stars so that people don't have light at night. And I've just said it, and it reminds me of Putin, who targets Ukrainian electric infrastructure to take away the light. It's just like universal truth. But here we come to a very important conclusion. In Ukrainian mythology, in Ukrainian culture, devil is not seen as something invincible, something very strong. Typically, they are part like humorous comic characters, like smaller than people. And there are lots of Cossack legends where Cossacks were able to trick devils and make devils serve them on various missions, putting them in the pocket. And in Hohel's story, we have a similar moment. So I think that's exactly what we do right now with the Kremlin goblin, with the Kremlin devil, and we will trick him.
The bunker
because
goblin, yeah.
that is a bunker gob, whatever, but this is a disgusting evil spirit, and we know how to treat them. So I believe it's a magical time when we have to be both careful, but at the same time remember that good always prevails over evil.
And another aspect of this, of course, is going to be personal experience as well, because both of us, I mean, you're more immediately, I think, exposed to that, obviously, but we both have experiences of the Russian world. And indeed, we both will remember that period of the resurgence of the Russian imperial identity from the period in the 90s, where essentially, that's the period when I was there, where central government and the security services especially were greatly weakened by the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union. So this isn't to say they went away or they transformed or there was any great. They were simply weakened and not able to exert their control over every aspect of life. They became quite sort of, they turned on to internal struggles rather than the external struggle. And I think that's where a lot of the issues come because in the West we still associate the sort of 80s and 90s with Gorbachev and reform and all of this. But ultimately what you've got is centralized sort of toxic controlling power which sort of loses its grip, but it doesn't transform at all. And it spends those years underground, merging with other toxic elements of society like the mafia, only to then start. And this was actually happening when I was there in the 90s. It starts penetrating different parts of society and the bureaucracy. And it's all happening sort of out of sight. But if you're involved in business, if you're a foreign investor or something, or if you're, you start to get that sense of what's going on. But it's something that a lot of people would have missed or not poorly understood. And then, of course, under Putin, he doesn't just magically appear in 2000. He is the end result of this resurgence of the sort of toxicity that's taken many years to sort of, warp and take control of different parts of the state. But then it becomes super visible. And we've both got sort of experiences of that and memories of that. But also with you, it's more direct, isn't it? Because, you would have had to learn Russian in your youth. You will have to listen now to the sort of propagandistic nonsense, the toxic nonsense in Russian. So the very language and very associations have become toxic, but you kind of have to selectively expose yourself to them. How do you do that without, without dare I say it, feeling sort of dirty or traumatized by it?
That's a good question. And I can actually tell you that as a Ukrainian, I've experienced this years of Russia's imperial extreme weakness in the 90s, at the beginning of 90s, and how it all changed dramatically by the end of 90s and when Putin actually came to power. I went to school in the already independent Ukraine, so I don't have experience of being a pioneer or an Oktyabrenok or something like that. I was actually the first class of the independent Ukraine, and I remember that was a very inspiring period for many people, and it was a period of very strong and beautiful national revival, and partially because Russia did not have strength to interfere at that moment because they were dividing the resources. New mafia groups pretended to become political parties. People were fighting for control over natural resources, and Ukrainians had to work with their lives, and we had this opportunity. And I was actually lucky not to have lessons of Russian language at school. And it was no more a necessity as it was for generations before me. But later, with this return to the orbit of Moscow, it all started to penetrate on different levels of your everyday life. And as a school child, for example, you can see foreign literature returning in a format of very much like Russian literature. And by the way, just before the Revolution of Dignity, Maidan in 2014, the former Minister of Science and Education of Ukraine, Dmytro Tabachnik, who later escaped to Russia, got Russian citizenship, and actually right now is the deputy of the Russian parliament. A kind reminder. He was working hard on this changing of literature in Ukrainian schools into literally Russian literature, where everything rotates around that idea. So it was actually very interesting how your personal memories filter important historical moments, focusing on things that are important for you from that perspective. To describe you like the level of poverty in the 90s. I can tell you, and I keep repeating, I perhaps should stop repeating this story, but that will be the last time, that like bananas were a good New Year present. And I remember sniffing them in a room because there's like greener bananas and they were sold greener in Ukraine, in Soviet Union before the collapse, because you can preserve them longer. And I could sense, and I was looking for them, and I could not find it because that's a present for a new year. I am sure that like children my age in the United Kingdom receive different kind of presents, not like bananas.
And
And it's actually beautiful to read that banana prices are very high right now in
yeah.
Russia.
Do you know what's
So
extraordinary, Anna, though? Yeah. That story
this is
about
how I remember.
bananas. Yeah, sorry. The story about
Yeah,
bananas. I heard
and
the same story from my grandmother. My grandmother lived in Vienna and was born in 1912, I think, or 1907. I need to check up on that. But she was basically born in the early part of the 20th century. And after the loss of the First World War, there was starvation and real issues, feeding children and so on in Austria in the late tens of the 20th century. And she told me the story about seeing her first banana as well, you know, in like 1919, 1920. But no one told her that you had to eat the inside. So she ate the outside as well and said, like, these bananas are
Oh my God,
disgusting, you know, how can anyone eat them?
they're so crispy. Yeah, but that's actually a funny thing that I often say on my channel, that somehow my childhood experience can be equal not to my peers in the UK, but to the generation of their parents or grandparents. Um, like I mean, the number of sweaters that you have or the possibilities to travel. And I'm not saying that my family was poor, we were middle class, but that's what a middle class could afford. And coming back to this reflections, I could clearly see when they tried to return back Russian language, like why? Like it's not like, why Russian? Why not German? Why not French? And there are other small moments, or when it became very important to film like documentaries or series that were popular together with Russia or in Moscow, or even when there were films from Ukraine, they would never name a city or something. It would be just like city N. That can literally be everywhere in Russia, in Ukraine, in Kyrgyzstan. And this is another way to spread this image of Soviet Union still exists. This project can be recreated, and so on. So unfortunately, until we defeat this imperial character of Russia, none of the countries that were once in the sight of Moscow is safe.
We were talking about literature there, and I think it's quite extraordinary that actually, when I recall it, the first Russian literature I read, and even the first Russian I met, are both Ukrainian. So Gogol, or Gogol, as it's translated in English, and of course from the Russianized, Russified form, was actually short stories, his Ukrainian nights, sort of series of stories, evenings on a farm near Dikanka and so on. And then very rich sort of folklore comes through there, but also the sort of humor, the satire, the irony. And there's a warmth, of course, you have there, which is absent in his St. Petersburg stories. St. Petersburg stories are far more about the effects of bureaucracy on small people and their psychology and the sort of warped dreams and fantasies that come out of, I would say, the psychopathy of living at the heart of the Russian Empire. I mean, so they're fascinating, but it's a very different character, isn't there, between the two types of story. But it also turned out in 1992, the first Russian I met, because I shared a room in MGU, which is Moscow State University, big Stalin-esque building on Sparrow Hills. And you had two rooms with a shared bathroom. And it turned out that the, person who was, sharing that corridor with me was a Ukrainian who was, I think, an engineer training in the engineering faculty. So, I've got those connections right back without really necessarily fully consciously realizing it.
God always protected you, Jonathan. Even when you were in Russia, it sent you Ukrainians to safeguard your mentality and spirit. You're right. And I think that Gogol is definitely one of really great and worth reading authors. Russia tried to steal him. He was born in a very problematic period of our history when it was impossible to preserve Ukrainian cultural identity, but he did a lot. And I think he's one of the writers that best described this huge difference between Ukrainians and Russians, even if he didn't intend that. And you have just highlighted it. Have a look at this evening before Christmas, night before Christmas. We have a Ukrainian Cossack who does not want to accept troubles in his life, and he actually grabs a devil, puts that devil into his pocket, and makes the devil do what he wants. And in his Russian novels, like The Dead Souls or something, he describes this central actually to the Russian mentality concept of small people. You can never hear it on the streets of Ukraine. Like, I don't hear people say it, even in the most like pessimistic district and a tiny village. And in Russia, they keep repeating, what can we do? We are small people. It is both a serious trauma, and it is also an escape mechanism when you don't want to share collective responsibility and you say just you're a small person. And in Ukraine, literally every person feels the responsibility for the country. That's why our volunteering movement is alive. That's why at the very first days of invasion, it was people who stopped the tanks. It was not yet the army or the president. Like all of them were important, but every person mattered. And that is why I have this a little bit dark joke that, Putin often says that he hits only decision-making centers in Ukraine, when literally he targets apartment buildings, hospitals, and schools. But to some extent, this is true because every Ukrainian house, every Ukrainian school, every Ukrainian cafe is a decision-making center. Because we do take responsibility for our life and we can make decisions and we can say, no, Zelensky, we don't like that. No, Jonathan, that's not the way it should be. And Gogol described that very well.
And it's interesting, isn't it? And that pathology of the hierarchical society, he captures it in a way, and the lies that underpin it as well. He captures it in a way that no Russian author actually ever does. There's a humor and a satire there. There's a seriousness and a lightness at the same time, which can perhaps only come from an external observer. Stories like Chinel and Nos. Dostoevsky tries, I think, in something like Dvaynik or The Double, to do a kind of Gogolian type satire, but it lacks the kind of lightness and satirical element. And that I only became aware at the full scale war that my other favorite Russian artist, which is Ilya Repin. Of course, turns out is actually Ukrainian. But again, once you realize that, you look at his work, and there's a lightness in there. There's an imagination, but also there's deep satirical and social commentary. And that seems to me that that can only come from someone who's outside, who's experienced another culture, and then is able to get under the skin of Russian culture. Now, of course, Russians will adopt both of these artists as their own. They will seek to appropriate them and in some way, take pride in that which is not theirs to take. But also there's the process of neutering or diminishing the impact of the commentary by appropriating it. And do you think there's what's your impression of the dynamic there of how Russia appropriates artists? It's not just to increase their status, it's also to try to cut the impact of the satire that is inherent in these kind of works.
I can tell you one of the greatest conclusions that I had during this period, like of war with Russia, that by stealing history, by stealing art, you cannot steal the qualities that you should possess to be able to create this history and this art. And Russia's decision to substitute the history with the history of Kiev Rus, or to pretend that some of the greatest artists, philosophers, writers were Russian, when in reality they were Ukrainian, it is actually a bomb that will explode and destroy Russia itself. It all happened perhaps in the 18th century. It became extremely vivid when Russian Empress Catherine II, who was actually German by origin, as the majority of Russian tsars and so on, they were not bearers of Russian cultural identity. And she started reading Russian history, and she felt very depressed because nothing bright and interesting was happening there, and it did not correspond to the level of the imperial project she and people before her, like Peter I, wanted to develop. And she organized a specific commission on rewriting, and now it would be named rebranding of the Russian Empire, by stealing Kiev Rus heritage, renaming some princes, trying to depict that Moscow was the center of this really big medieval civilization. And it is all built on fakes. It demanded serious investment of money, bribery of some Western intellectuals, and what is worse, that destruction of lots of archives. For example, after the destruction of Zaporizhia siege, the majority of Cossack archives were taken to St. Petersburg and perished there. And Ukrainian Kiev Mohila Academy, I've mentioned you, one professor from that university was burned accidentally. It all resembles modern time attitude when they target the Museum of Ukrainian Philosophers, Skovoroda, when they want to destroy other buildings and universities in Ukraine. So it's not the first time that we go through it, and imagine how irritates it Ukrainians when people keep saying it's a proxy, it's a NATO-provoked war, it's the US. Guys, we have problems since like 18th century. The United States were still shaping at that time. They did not have money or inspiration to interfere. And there is one optimistic thing that I should say in this Christmas time, that no matter what happens, even in 2025, plans for negotiations or appeasement or something like that, I know that Ukraine will not perish, will not disappear, because we had this like for 300 years. Despite all the terror and violence, we managed to survive. The only thing that it would be so much kinder and so much better to save thousands of Ukrainian lives, Ukrainian minds. But even if you sacrifice us, and I don't know, we become a part of Russia, we will start shaking again. We will start destroying Russia. It will happen in 10 years, in 20 years. It's inevitable, eternal process until the collapse of the Russian Federation of the Russian Empire. And of course, it's better to save more good people and make it happen faster than simply postpone this agony of Moscow for centuries to come.
And this is an interesting comment by someone I was talking to last week. Now, the Western media, again, often will have, and many people have problems really understanding the concept of victory. They use sort of phrases, and as Russia incrementally gains control of devastated towns and cities and poisoned fields and land that it's destroyed, it's incrementally taking little slices away. And in the lazier corners of the media, that is portrayed as Ukraine losing and Russia winning and all this stupid, simplistic language. If we take a step back and look at it from more of a macro point of view, Russia has already lost because, let's say, go back to prior to 2014, there are a lot of people throughout Ukraine, but especially in the east, who didn't want to be part of Russia, but didn't necessarily have any antipathy to Russia at that point, and who didn't necessarily, have an allergic reaction against the Russian language or Russian literature or the very concept of Russian imperialism, because it's a generation or several generations away since, the last great sort of imperial imposition in the 40s, let's say, in the 30s and the 40s, and the terror there, it sort of softened, and the memory of that, the knowledge of that started to recede to an extent. But through Russian aggression, it has completely rekindled this study or trying to understand, what Russian imperialism is. It's produced a reassessment of Russian history, an extremely negative reassessment of it. Many Ukrainians, I believe, are now switched to Ukrainian rather than Russian, even if they're not as fluent in Ukrainian as they are in Russian. They're making the conscious choice to immerse themselves in it, communicate in that language, and to discover the literature and history, which hadn't perhaps been such an urgent task. Now, no, that's not everyone. A lot of people who and especially people on the channel and activists from Maidan and Orange Revolution had started that process earlier on. They were at the cutting edge, but now it seems to become a mass movement. This in itself already is a huge victory for Ukraine because it strikes me there's no going back. And a much bigger portion of the Ukrainian population are now aligned with what could have been previously described as a Western Ukrainian point of view. Is that simplistic, or can we frame this as long-term Ukraine being victorious?
There is definitely much sense in what you are saying. One of the things that I want to contradict is that Russia did try to create this very serious divide between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine, but sociology, even in mid-2000s, illustrated that in reality there is no big difference between the way East Ukraine, West Ukraine, South or North sees the future. We have to remember that the closer you are to Moscow, the more problems you have, the closer you are to the epicenter of evil. And those very Russified and culturally ruined regions of Ukraine are actually the ones where Russia committed genocide, Holodomor. And it's exactly the territory of the East Ukraine with lots of fields. It's actually a breadbasket of the world. And after the most neutral estimates give 4 million, some give 7 million people died in these regions. And Jonathan, that's the size of country in Europe. There was a very massive relocation of people to these regions. And these were Russian people who came to live there. And it was an intended policy to change the cultural identity of this region. So first of all, that's what we have to mind. It's not like an organic process, simply these people chose. Then in Soviet Union, Russian language, Russian culture was the Soviet language and the Soviet culture. It was the basics for your success in career and elsewhere. Another very important reminder to our viewers is that it's not a natural process or choice, or you would say, I'm bilingual because my mother is French and my father is Spanish. It's not a natural process. It's a very strong, violent process of Russification, and it happened not only in Ukraine. It happened in Belarus, it happened in Central Asia, and all that resulted in a serious loss for the mankind in general, because national literatures disappeared, national writers were executed, as in Ukraine, executed Renaissance, and lots of things. It did not happen just because they chose Russian. It was a serious, very bloody policy. You know, I'm a linguist and I will not touch this subject, but there are lists of banned words of Ukrainian language that were banned in the 30s, and they were taken out during the Stalin's terror, and you could not find them in Russia-Ukrainian dictionaries since 1950s. And there are lists of these words and literally comments of Russian communists saying that don't use this word, it's bourgeois nationalistic, bourgeois. So what are these words? They were not political words. That was a word, for example, for a blonde. You can hear maybe just one word as an illustration. We have two words to describe a blonde woman. One will be blondinka. And Jonathan, you know English, Russian, you can hear that blondinka and
Yeah.
blondinka sound very similar. So of course it was okay to use the word blondinka. But there is a Ukrainian word for that, and that would be bilavka. Bilavka does not sound
Sounds
like
much
blondinka.
softer, doesn't it? It's
It's different. It's just like not the same. So bilavka, just a name for a blonde woman, was banned as a nationalist word. It's not a name for a party. It's not a name of a leader. It's a name of the color of your hair. And it was too Ukrainian. And that's what they did with like hundreds of words, because they were different. It included even this like words connectors and so on that were different from they were artificially illustrating that, oh, there is no big difference between the languages and so on. It's a massive and very awful policy. So why do we have so many people that spoke Russian in Ukraine? Is not by choice, is not because of their family heritage, but because of very intentional policy. And you are right, Putin achieved the country. He wanted to denationalize country, and he actually, to some extent, nationalized it, because for many people, Russian is the language of the people who come to kill us. And honestly, when I receive a message from the unknown number and it's in English or in Ukrainian, I feel relaxed. But when it's in Russian, I subconsciously think, well, who's that? What's happening? I don't even want to feel like that, but that's my physiological reaction. And many people switch to Ukrainian. Moreover, it's not that difficult because luckily we had these years of independence. It was back at school and people were speaking it everywhere. So it's not something impossible. And of course, they saw, I think 2014 was enough to see what Ruski Mir is, what happened to Donetsk, once blooming city with very expensive, beautiful real estate, with hotels, with an airport,
the football
with
stadiums,
stadium.
yeah.
Yeah, what happened? And I think it educated people around the area very well. And for me, like Russia worked really hard with Kharkiv, because Kharkiv was an important scientific, cultural center back in times of the USSR. They actually made it the first capital of the USSR, not Kyiv. And that was the city where I defended my PhD, so it's close to my heart. And they worked really hard to like persuade people, to make them want, I don't know, Ruski Mir. And look how resilient, how beautifully resilient Kharkiv is. And the constant shellings, people live there, coffee shops are working there, and they are very, very Ukrainian. And they stand strong, they stand firm. And that is an illustration how Russia actually Ukrainized Kharkiv like to 1,000%.
And my period, my experience of Russia is really the core period is from 1992 to 1998. So that's fairly the interesting years, let's say. I mean, that almost reflects what Putin said there. He was bored and needed to, create something that was interesting. The goblins are. So that's another topic. But in the 90s, a lot of people who are educated in Russia, or if you're in St. Petersburg, which still seem to have pride in being a sort of separate culture, and they look down on Muscovites as they'd call them the Большая деревня, the big village. But everyone wanted to leave. No one wanted to stay. No one had any of this sense of pride in nation. The empire had collapsed. As you say, there were sort of, the phantom pains of a limb that's no longer there. They didn't celebrate the loss of empire. It's something that's painfully nostalgic and, or you just pretend it hasn't happened because it's a source of shame, not pride. But they wanted to leave. They saw no future, material future, and no political future there. In fact, no one really talked about politics at all, and that's part of the problem. But it also meant that you met some interesting people, some people who would try to explain to you their country in the sort of ways we're discussing. So, I had a good friend who was a doctor. Um, and he was a very traumatized individual, but a very funny individual. And he worked with homeless children on the streets of St. Petersburg. And he was a frontline doctor funded by a German charity. So, of course, he got to see not the fantasy version, not the Potemkin facade. He got to see the real country. And he was quite an open personality. I've tried to track him down. I'm sure because he'd get himself into problems all the time because he was a fairly open, critical kind of guy, and he loved to drink. He was always getting into wild problems, and his day job was extremely dangerous. Several times a week he'd go and visit something called the Kresti, which is the main prison in St. Petersburg, or one of the main prisons, and it's a Tsarist era building, which at the time was housing 5 times more prisoners than it was designed to hold in the 19th century, including children as young as sort of 7 or 9, which is completely illegal. But they had nowhere else to put them and they didn't care. So they take children who were abused, children who were forced into prostitution, drug taking, etc. They'd haul them off the streets and they'd throw them into an adult prison without overcrowding. And so he'd see that week in, week out. So quite an honest character. And he'd try and tell me various stories and anecdotes to illustrate what Russia is. And with my slightly sort of soft, forgiving Western kind of mind, I struggled to understand some of these stories. That's why he turned them into sort of, anecdotes and stories. And one of the anecdotes basically hinged on understanding the concept that everything Russia touches turns to shit. And of course, you don't want to believe that. You don't want to believe that. But then he tried to keep.
That will be my new favorite quote.
I'm going to put it in an episode next week. It's too good not to use in an episode, especially
Yeah,
applied to the Black Sea mazout engine oil that's been spilled over the beaches of
what
Anapa.
happened?
But it's true. I mean,
Yeah.
I've been on trains throughout. I went on a train to Irkutsk, for instance, which is 5 days and 5 nights. At one point, the train went past a single factory complex, which was about 20 miles long. I mean, not just a few blocks, it's 20 miles of ruined, rusty, disused Soviet military industrial complex stuff. I think it was past Perm, between Perm and Tomsk or something. And you just look at the sheer absolute devastation, the trauma inflicted upon nature, and what we're seeing now becomes less surprising. But he told me, this actor, he was like, he desperately wanted me to understand his experience of Russia and the trauma of it. And he was brought up on the island of Valam, which is now an open island. It's a bit of a museum sort of place, but then it was closed community with very few facilities, and actually a lot of alcoholics and people with mental problems were just shipped onto the island. So it was a bit like he described it as an insane asylum, but with all the patients walking around the streets. And a very underfunded place. And he was living in an общежитие, which is like a hostel, student hostel, when he was studying. And he described to me, for him, what Russia is. And he says, he remembers one day sitting on the toilet in this общежитие, and he's looking out at the floor of the bathroom, and he said it's ankle deep in shit, literally floating. You have to sort of step on little islands of paving stones, but it's literally ankle deep in shit. And you're trying not, and it's a hole in the ground, which a lot of Russian communal toilets are. So I never got the hang of that. It's like you can put a freaking man on the moon, but you still have to shit over a hole in the ground. Anyway, that's my own personal. I have a problem with that. But anyway, he's looking out of the window at the monastery that's just been handed back to the church, and they've gilded the cupola. They've just taken the scaffolding down, and he's looking out, and it's brilliant sunshine reflecting. So you've got this almost vision of heaven, this incredible sun off a newly covered cupola, this pure gold reflection coming in. And then he looks down, and he's ankle deep in shit. And he says, that for him was Russia. You don't need to understand anything more than that image.
That is poetic, and I think nothing really changed. Maybe Russia is now like, neck deep in shit. And I think that many people know so little about real Russian life that they substitute it with images they've read in the books from the 19th century, like, 200 years already passed. And they also love some documentaries or I don't know, but they don't have any imagination of what real Russia or life on this post-Soviet territory was. And now, like, I see this Russia-funded YouTubers, Russia-funded people on Twitter everywhere, especially those in the United States, in Europe, that have never been to Russia. And one thing I wish to them is just to come and live in Russia for at least a year, but not in Moscow,
Not in
not in
Moscow,
St.
no, no.
Petersburg, but just on one of these territories. And Russia is not just fake, it substitutes to the country what is happening. You've mentioned this island. That is a very spooky place. And it also reminded me about the specific islands that Soviet Union had for the veterans of the Second World War. And there were lots of people who were traumatized, who lost their limbs, and they were not cared by the state. And there were many of them because, once again, Ukraine was a big part of the Soviet army. Every fifth hero of the Soviet Union is Ukrainian. Main theater of the Second World War was on the territory of Ukraine, not Russia. They were not fighting in Moscow, but they were fighting in Kyiv. And at the same time, they won the war with the help of our allies, but also with immense human losses. Practicing the very same technique of meat grinders and like losing people with the speed of light. But there were lots of traumatized people, lots of people with severe injuries, and they were not respected and honored by the state. They were sent away on various islands where they had really bad conditions to live, and they were hidden from this public eye. And for a very long period of time, they did not have parades, the victory parades. It's newer. and they chose these beautiful images of veterans, not the true victims of that war. And now they describe themselves as beautiful victors. Victors do not hide the people who actually uh, sacrificed everything to achieve the victory. And I think that one of the main tasks that like intellectuals, anthropologists, writers, YouTubers should do is to describe real Russia. We don't need to fantasize. We don't need to substitute anything. Just show it as it is. And how do you think why so many people in the world have very distorted image of Russia, even if they support Ukraine, the democratic world, they see Russia not the way it is and what can be done to finally show people the reality, because it will influence the decisions they make greatly.
Well, we both saw Tucker Carlson. Now, we know that he's a propagandist. We suspect that he is more than just, a useful idiot, let's put it that way. And of course, his video there shot in the Moscow metro. The Moscow metro is, of course, impressive. But that's because they tore down, a fifth of the ancient city to build it. They didn't care. They ripped stuff up. They sacrificed thousands and thousands of people and the money that was generated by the country to create this showpiece. So it's a propagandist perpetuating propaganda from the 1930s. But the center of Moscow, you can find these vistas and places where you say, wow, this is quite an impressive view. And it will be clean because, well, what do? Anyone who's sort of homeless and whatever, they'll ship them out to the suburbs. They'll beat them senseless. They will create this illusion of super wealthy society. And there's plenty of people now, as there was in the Soviet Union, who will be part of the hierarchy and will pretend that none of the problems exist, that it is this kind of, fake society. Uh, I won't say the full details, but I've been in conversations with different family members, different siblings who brought up in the Soviet Union but lived in different parts. One didn't join the party, didn't really go along with any of that stuff, and had a really tough life. One of the sisters joined the not the party, but was a pioneer, and so had a slightly better life. And then the third sister, in this particular scenario, they're all in the kitchen drinking. It's early afternoon, and they start arguing about the past and the Soviet Union and how wonderful it was. And all three of them have different, very different conceptions, even though they lived in the same town at the same time. They have a completely different conception of the past, which directly relates to the level of privilege they had and the material existence they had. And that directly relates to how loyal they were to the regime. The third sister worked as a HR director in a coal mine. Now, I think anyone who understands the Soviet Union would be like, well, first of all, HR, that is a job where you have to have communication with the KGB. You just have to, because the role isn't there to protect the workers, it's to spy on them and inform on them. A coal mine is a strategic objective associated with the military industrial complex because coal is a strategic resource that keeps that part of the economy going. So if you're the director of HR in a coal mine, well, the likely is you're probably a low-level KGB functionary. And this, I think, is also important to understand it. Your perception of Russia now, your perception of Russia and the Soviet Union directly relates to where you are in the vertical and the hierarchy. And that in turn relates to how loyal you are to power and what you're prepared to say. And I don't want to quote Russian literature because, as Peter Pomerantsev said, it's not a living literature. It's more like a necrology. It's more like a dissection on the sort of hospital slab. It's an autopsy rather than a living literature. But there is an author who's quite interesting called Vladimir Sorokin. And he has this concept. I don't know if you come across this called there's a thing called norma, and you go throughout the book, and it's almost like
Mhm.
describing a Soviet existence, but everyone keeps talking about norm. You know, if you had your norm today, have you had your quota of whatever it is? And you kind of assume, because it's not described what that actually is, you kind of assume that it's propaganda of some sort. It's some duty you have to do. It's only later in the book you realize that norm is shit, that they have to eat a certain quantity of feces every day because that is what the regime has said. And then you have to go back and reread the whole book, and you're like, oh my God, you know, and they're describing the different textures and flavors of it. And, it was horrible today or whatever. It wasn't so horrible today. But this is kind of it. For a better material existence, you have to demonstrate loyalty to the system. And the propaganda, I believe, and I got some interesting people on the channel who've been running experiments in Z Patriot chat rooms to test how the mechanics of Russian propaganda work. I think we come to the realization that propaganda isn't there to convince you of something. It has several purposes. One is to sort of help deny your agency, but the most important one is loyalty. So it doesn't matter how nonsensical the propaganda is. You don't have to believe it. That's not obligatory, but you do have to repeat it. You do have to show your loyalty to the nonsense. And I think, the press conference of the bunker czar is in that same thing. As a propagandist and as a good citizen, you have to eat your daily dose of norm. You have to consume the shit, and you have to demonstrate that that's what you've done, and therefore, you conform, and you're less at risk of being eradicated. The problem with Ukrainians is they refuse to eat their norm, and they refuse to repeat the nonsense that is passed down to them. And I think this is fundamentally why so many Russians do not say anything, because they're like, why can't Ukrainians just shut up and eat their daily dose of shit like we do? Why can't they just, be
Yeah.
normal, as it were? Why do they have to be different and outspoken and have original ideas? You know, yeah, I think there's a resentment there because
This is,
you're also threatening their peace and comfort. They want to forget about all this. They just want to repeat what they're told, and you're disturbing this. Ukrainians are making life difficult for Russians.
yeah, and if a similar invasion happened on Russia as it did on Ukraine, they would get Moscow really quickly. The thing is that nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to enter that shit. Because I think the very first word that now we associate with Russia, taken into the context of our conversation, is that shit. So nobody wants to step on it, like nobody wants that. But if we had like an army marching in the direction of Moscow, as they did with Kiev, nobody would stop them. It was we saw that with Prigozhin, we saw that in Kursk, and that is why Putin was totally deceived by his perception of population that something similar will happen. Many forgot that Russian propagandists, before the start of invasion, months before that, depicted that Ukrainian people will greet Russian tanks with flowers. And it did not happen. And why? Because Russians, deceived by that propaganda, still think that Ukrainians are just the same, and if we accepted eating that dose of shit every day, they will. No, no, we won't. And that is another thing that people forget when choosing the politics toward the defeat of Russia. They constantly afraid something will happen. We have one pathetic Kremlin goblin who keeps threatening the world with Oreshnik, but in reality, it is not about something big or strong. It's just a gang of people. And if you, for example, go to Moscow, your task is just to neutralize Putin and maybe 20, 50 people around him, and no one will do anything in Russia. They will not go out on the streets as they do in Ukraine. You've seen that. They don't have this gene. I don't know.
They lack trust. There's no trust between individuals. And I think this is why one of the main KGB mythologies. Now, when I was there in 1998, I had a sort of slightly curious habit, which is I would keep a little notebook, and every time I heard something that I thought was slightly weird or slightly odd or sounded slightly like a historical mythology, I kind of write it down in this little notebook. Unfortunately, I lost the notebook, but I remembered quite a few of them.
Oh, I think it had like 10 volumes of it.
Yes, I had a lot of time on my hands. There wasn't much to do, and I didn't really have any money at the time. Um, but I wrote a lot of these things down, and yeah, I think it is interesting. But one of the main mythologies is that democracy isn't possible in Russia. Now, it will only emerge under certain circumstances, and it's nothing like the emergent property of democracy in Ukraine. But there's nothing genetic, genetically incapable of Russians. But many of them will repeat it, and even those who are, I would say, in the diaspora who've lived in Britain for many years, I've had arguments, and they're like, it works here. And they're quite perfectly willing to admit that if you transplant Russians out of Russia and you put them in Britain or whatever, they'll go and they'll work and they'll pay their taxes and they'll follow the law and they'll follow the laws of the system that they slot themselves into. They won't be necessarily politically active because very few Russians are politically active, but they will go along with the war. So they can function in a democracy perfectly well. And they're very good at following rules and orders. And so that works quite well for most of them. It seems, or at least the ones I've met, they function perfectly well in Western societies. So they're not incapable. But what they lack, I think, at a fundamental level is law and trust. And law ultimately is not just what's written on a piece of paper, it's about trust between individuals and having a common story. And you ask, I've had this argument with many of them. They'll say, look, it works here, but it doesn't work with us. We will never have democracy because blah, 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 blah. But I also detect some artificial narratives in there. I think it was in the interests of the communist regime and the Bolsheviks to perpetuate this idea that it's either firm rule of law, it's either the strong man or chaos, and that the natural order of Russians is chaos, like was seen in the Civil War scenario. Because for them, I think Maidan and any removal of the strong man at the top, they got this subconscious idea that right, we're back in 1921, and it's absolute barbarity and slaughter, and everyone will turn on each other. It reminds a little bit of that argument you might sometimes have with people who are I would say, sort of Christian fundamentalists. They'll say, how can you have order and morality if there's no God? And it's simplistic and it's childish. But I think the Russians fall into that same thing. Without a strong man, we would all literally run around the streets, wiping each other out. I think that's a myth that needs to be eroded. And what Ukraine has shown is that you can have various techniques to build up democracy from the ground up. You mentioned earlier, before we hit record, about stairwells. This isn't just about, a big democratic ideas. It's about democracy existing in every building, in every street, in every area, district, town, village, people expressing themselves and having to listen to things they don't necessarily agree with. And it's about that sort of democratic culture and evolution of trust. I'd be interested to hear what you think about that.
I totally agree with you. Though I am not that optimistic about Russians taken out of Russia and living in democratic countries, because I still see that many of them try to undermine the law and order of these countries. That's what we often observe in Latvia, for example, or in Germany. Also, lots of Russian oligarchs spoil Britain. I'm sure you will agree on that. So not
Absolutely,
all of
yes.
them follow the rules, except there are also lots of them who don't want to learn the language, who keep disrespecting their culture or the citizenship demands, for example, in the Baltic countries. So the process is not that smooth. Plus, another very important thing, there are thousands of Russians, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions that fled Russia because they don't want to get
Yeah.
mobilized. Maybe some of them oppose Russian war against Ukraine, but you do not see them uniting in serious civil or political movements. We keep repeating about that. There are some speaking heads, but these are like few people. You don't see anyone thinking about the potential return to Russia. They all keep repeating, we are small people, there is nothing we can do. So they literally don't have any hopes for Russia. If this so-called good Russians don't have any hope for Russia, how can we have? Like,
Mm.
oh my God.
But it's interesting, Anna,
And
because
another,
I've had these conversations, many of them. What you also find is, some people may, work hard and follow the rules, but if you have a deep conversation with about stuff, some, not all, but many of them will continue to perpetuate the mythologies that they learned in the Soviet Union, the mythologies and lies which the Soviet Union tried to plant in their heads. And some of them will still watch propagandistic media, even though they live here. So, yeah, I mean, what I
yeah.
meant was many will follow the rules, but they won't absorb the democratic culture, and many will say, "Oh, Britain's awful." They live here and they benefit from
Yeah.
all of the, but they'll say, "Oh, it's awful," and they'll perpetuate the myths, like the Tucker Carlson one about how wonderful Moscow is and blah 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 and great Russian culture. So that still goes on.
And another important thought that you've shared in your words previously is that Russia tries to illustrate that like living by laws, as the majority of the democratic countries do, is no more fashionable. And we have this like rule of power must dominate. And if Russia succeeds, then we are screwed because there is China. There are other insane like North Korea then is stronger than, I don't know, Lithuania. But I would like to live according to the Lithuanian rules, not the North Korean. And that's why rules matter. And that's why by defeating Russia, we actually protect these rules. And we return back to one of the central messages that I want to highlight. It is not about standing with Ukraine. It's not about helping Ukraine. It's about stopping the greatest criminal on the planet that undermines all the things that are important for the secure functioning of the world.
Definitely. And we see that in the Black Sea. It's so vivid. They've got their illegal grey fleet. Three or even four tankers have now broken up in stormy seas, and we see that black, viscous engine oil, washing up on beaches. And I saw some corners of the media continue to resort to the laziest kind of headlines. And the headline was Russia battles oil slick. I'm like, excuse me? They caused it, but there's no evidence of the state battling it or caring about it or putting resources into fixing the problem or stopping the thing that caused the problem in the first place. There's no evidence of it. So why would this particular newspaper position it almost putting some kind of agency or sort of almost sort of implying that the state is furiously dealing with the problem? No, it's caused the problem and is doing nothing about the problem and is not changing its behavior in any way. And yet there has, throughout this 3 years, been a failure to say Russia did it. Russia killed those people. Russia committed genocide. Russia committed genocide against the environment, ecocide.
Yes.
There's a failure to just be black and white and to describe reality.
Yeah. Yeah, and even good newspapers will say like Kyiv reports Russian strike on the capital of Ukraine. Uh, People intentionally take the responsibility of Russia because they don't want to punish it, because they are afraid of it. And why are they afraid of it? Because they know nothing about this land of shit.
Absolutely. Well, let's turn to, we've got a few minutes left. Let's turn to some more stories of Mordor and experiences of Mordor because some stand out sort of quite clearly. And I have to say, not being at this point, not being an academic or being in academia for a long time, I have sort of, kept up my knowledge of Russia, but I'm not, I would say, I don't have the sort of academic depth there. But what I do have is these memories. I have these memories of traveling experiences and conversations, and I do draw very heavily on some of them for my interpretations. And many of these stories did not occur in the capital cities necessarily, but in going out and visiting the countryside, visiting provincial towns, because that is a richer source of, I think, experience of the real Russia, and it's incredibly traumatic at the same time. There was one particular instance where I was in a village, and it was the evening. It was a nice evening, and it's on the shores of a large lake. So I'd been taking the dogs for a walk, and we're walking back home with a friend. And they'd recently, it's one of these villages which hadn't had tarmac road. It had a kind of rubble or stones on the road. So of course you'd have to drive your car relatively slowly, otherwise you get a burst tire. But they'd recently got enough money to tarmac the road, but they didn't do both halves. They did one half of the road. So one was rubble and one was the. So what carters would do is, if there's nothing coming onwards, they'd drive on the tarmac on the opposite side of the road. And then if something was coming, they'd flip over. And I remember looking back behind me to where the sun was setting, and I saw in the distance, about half a mile away, it's a very straight road, a van coming. I turn around, carry on walking, turn around again, and it was much, much closer. And my brain was like, okay, that must be going really, really fast. That's incredibly fast van. And then I turned around and realized that it was not just, it was weaving between, it was on the rubble one minute and it was on the paved bit the next. And I thought, okay, this is a bit scary. It's going at an extraordinary speed and appears to be a little bit out of control. And then things happened very, very fast. I realized that I'd have to jump out of the way with the friend and the dog, or we're going to get killed. So I pushed them both into a ditch and then dived into the ditch myself. So all very dramatic. And then the van sped past us, and just about sort of 10, 15 meters ahead of us, it just did a really big veer off the road. It hit a telegraph pole, like an electricity pole, just smacked into it, wrapped itself around the pole, and then the pole came down so that all the electric wires are on the road dancing around with blue sparks and so you can be killed multiple ways like that. Once the electricity had sort of cut out because all the lights went off in the village, we thought, okay, it's safe to go. Let's go and see if the driver's alive. So we went to the van, the front of the window of the van, and the whole. It's a wreck, and the whole windscreen is smashed out. But there's no sign of a driver at all. So looking around, and then about 20 meters away, someone gets up off the road, and it's the driver, and it's a young Russian man. Absolutely, to use the English phrase, shit-faced. He is so drunk. He doesn't know what day of the week it is or what name and he's been thrown 20 meters out of the windscreen of this van. But because he was drunk, he's probably quite floppy. No broken limbs, barely a scratch on him, just walking down the road looking at his bottle, which was smashed. He's quite disappointed that his vodka bottle got damaged in the whole thing. I just couldn't believe, this had happened. And then two interesting things happened the next day, and then the next week. When I went back to the village, in a couple of weeks' time, I heard a story that this guy who's been a bit of a loser, no one knew his name, now is famous throughout the oblast. He's famous because he survived a miracle. And he's got so many girlfriends, and people are obsessed with him because they think he's got some kind of divine aura about him, some protection of a saint. And then there was another conversation between, this was the next day, between two old ladies. And one was sort of, You know, she was looking at the place of the accident. She was shaking her head like this. And I thought what she was going to say was condemning the man, how dangerous it was. Um, no, what she actually said was, "Если не починили дорогу, это бы не случилось," which in English means if they hadn't done the road up, this never would have happened.
And that's how you get popular in Russia.
Yes.
That's
Surviving a
why Putin is so
catastrophic accident.
popular. Yeah, Putin is catastrophic for Russia, for Russian economy, for Russian state, and that's why he is so popular. And you know, we started with literature, and then my dad has this theory, and I fully agree with it. It's about Russian fairy tales, because once again, when I was a kid, like you had access to this Russian fairy tales, they were printed. And you know, some of them like Kolobok or maybe По щучьему велению, and
Hmm.
they describe like I believe that fairy tales are very important, as many like anthropologists agree that they illustrate the basics, these archetypes that live in the culture, and they actually represent the country quite well. The time, but also the country, and the majority of Russian fairy tales rotate around the idea that you are lazy, you don't want to do anything, and you want something to be brought to you. Like all the magic is not about you doing something or freeing a princess from a dragon or something. No, it's about having a magical like oven that can travel and bring you food or something. It's never about doing something. And also, like there are two or three fairy tales that describe a family that has nothing to eat, but not because they are like no harvest or something, but because they are lazy. The wife is lazy, the husband is lazy, and what they do, they take everything from scratch to get something. So it's not about working, it's about getting this leftovers. And it repeats itself when Russian invaders loot Ukrainian flats of the like very similar, simple middle class. And this is also like basics. When nothing is done, it's better. Like when the road is not repaired and you don't have enough food, when you don't want to work, and there is a tremendous difference between like Ukrainian villages and Russian villages. If you travel the railroad, you cross the border, and you know the nature remains the same, the sky remains the same, but fences disappear, orchards disappear, and people do not cut their grass, people do not paint their village houses. It all looks very dark, very gloomy, and you can tell, oh, I'm in Russia. And I'm not being stereotypical here, it's true. And one of the reasons why many Russians like support Putin's war is this internal jealousy or hatred towards people who are able to improve the space around them, who are able to have something, even if your country is not perfect, your government is not perfect, you lack money, you lack support, but still you're doing something, and by the end of your life, you achieve something. And Russia hates it. And if in Ukraine people were capable of doing that, uh, when Soviet Union came, they started this dekulakization, which is a tremendously tragic period, which is one of the reasons for Holodomor, taking away people's property and not letting this middle class shape. And by destroying middle class, you actually secure your authoritarian reign, because people who are hungry, people who are frightened, they don't ask questions, they don't think about like complex
They're
philosophical.
dependent, you know, and if they don't show loyalty, you'll
They are
starve, you know.
evil and hungry. They don't think about important things. They don't have like energy or time for that. So that's actually a tragedy. And I keep repeating that. In times of war, I feel happier to be Ukrainian than I'm sure an ordinary Russian feels. Even though like we have, as we record this video, there is an air raid alert. Literally, you can come anywhere in Ukraine. But I think that in total, Ukrainians are more satisfied with their self, like with their dignity, with our position in life, with the way we are treated by our society members than an average Russian in a relatively safe environment.
Yes, and that's something we can continue in a future conversation. But that what struck me. I know the villages around Lviv are not necessarily the same as those in Donbass or the center and whatever, and there's different characteristics in different places. But there were some really significant differences I noticed in the countryside, and you've just described some of them there. But the fact that it's not just that you've got a neat orchard and a nicely painted fence, and it's not a huge wall to keep the world out. It's also that the duchas or holiday cottages, no, some are slightly bigger than others. Some are, much older than others. Some are sort of part inhabited, some are not. But none of them were in a total state of disarray. Even amongst the sort of slightly poorer ones, there was a level of kind of order and upkeep, and what clearly is a kind of pride in them. And also,
Mhm.
you translate that into, well, why would you do that? You don't just do it for yourself. You do it because you're concerned about what people will think of you. There's a sense of
Yeah.
society, there's a sense of values and order, and you don't want the shame of being different to other people and having a property that is falling apart. I also noticed that it's not just your own little plot of land. People will keep the little plot of land that doesn't belong to them between their house and the ditch and the road. They will make sure that that is
Hmm.
clean as well. And that's incredibly important because when you go to pretty much any Russian village, some houses, in my experience, and this is going back a long time, this is the 90s, some houses, of course, are an utter, whatever you call it, just falling apart and not well kept. Some will be quite well kept. But what they have in common is none of them will pay any attention to the communal space, whether it's a communal stairwell in a city or the communal space between the road and their property. That's not their responsibility. So you don't have that sense of societal value or even caring about what other people might think of you.
Yeah. And that is why we cannot expect that any democratic movement will be born there. It can only be implanted, or that they will somehow protest and take away the regime of Putin. There is no hope in that, like with all my optimism.
This is something that takes many generations under favorable conditions. And I think that's what we fail to understand. And those who will listen to, people like Karamurza and others who might seem that they say some sensible things sometimes. I think there's a failure to understand the sheer scale of the task involved and the time it'll take. And you need favorable conditions plus time. If you don't fix the favorable conditions, then it will never emerge. These things will never, they won't fix themselves magically.
I have a question for your community. I will come to read the comments, and I would like to hear for their opinion who is the most promising Russian oppositioner. I am in a desperate search for a person I can partially support, at least like a person I can like quote, I don't know. And at this moment, I don't have any. I watch your videos, I follow some of these people, but I don't like them. I have my reasons. We can discuss that in some time, but there are some troublesome symptoms that, for example, I listen to the interview, I like a great part of it, and then voila, I see, oh, you have just exposed
Little
something about
phrase or
yourself.
something.
So maybe that I know, like we all say wrong phrases. That's normal. The more you speak, the more like weird things you may say. That's normal. But some are these like red flags, like in relationships, these are red flags that I see. And in Russian context, red flags are super. It reminds of the Soviet era. So I am interested to see what your audience thinks. I know they are well educated by themselves and watching your videos. That's a very quality audience. And I'm interested, what will they say? Whom will they nominate?
This is tricky, and I'll be honest with you. I've invited all of these opposition figures onto the channel. I mean, normally I only pick people who broadly I agree with because I'm not a journalist or a politician. I'm an activist. Um, and I don't want to give oxygen to people who are knowingly lying. But I do want to, and I did want to interview all the so-called leading opposition figures. A few have come on, but not really the politician ones. Some of the journalists have come on, and I've made sure that I interview them on things that I think they're best suited to talk about. So I would never ask a Russian to really talk much about Ukraine or Ukrainian culture or Maidan or anything like that, because it's just not appropriate. It's not their area of expertise. You know, if Masha Gessen comes on, for instance, I will not talk to her about Ukraine. I'll talk to her about the internal mechanics of the Russian state and Russian propaganda. You know, things where they're not going to be making stuff up or perpetuating mythologies. But whether you agree with the Russian guests I've got on or not, none of them, literally none of the people I've interviewed would think that Russia could be fixed quickly or even at all. So yeah, none of them will subscribe to this idea that the magical thinking that, say, the Navalny's team seem to embrace. I think all of them have a high degree of despair in that they do not think it's recoverable at this point, and certainly not for centuries, outside of the experience of our lifetimes. That's something I think we could probably agree with them, and it's depressing that those people who are, I would say, thinking, as it were, and not examining everything, or they might not have views we might agree with, but they are broadly examining, a lot of stuff, which when they're not representative at all, not even of the opposition, the majority of the population. They're also not representative of the opposition either. But most of them would admit that either they have no idea how to turn this around, or would embrace the idea that just at this point it's so broken. How do you go about fixing it? So that's rather a depressing place to end up on Christmas Eve, isn't it? I know we always end up to this, but it's important going into 2025
Well,
to understand this.
if we envision the future collapse of the Russian Federation, we see hope because it's impossible to control such territories without authoritarian regimes. There are lots of beautiful hidden nations there that can become trustworthy partners in future. Many of them aspire democratic changes, and now they are simply treated as resources by the Kremlin and also as meat for Russian meat grinders on the front lines. So maybe some of the Western leaders will listen to this Russian oppositioners and realize that there is no way to fix the modern day Russian Federation, and the only way is to control its dissolution, which is inevitable. And then I think that's a positive ending of the video.
I think that's about as positive as we can get at this point. Well, I think we should do more of these. There's plenty more odd stories, which I think are sort of illustrative of why I think a certain way about Russia and why I share your view that the empire must fall for the benefit of Ukraine and countries around Russia, but also for the benefit of its own population. I wouldn't call them citizens because it's not a nation and it doesn't have a citizenry. But these things can only emerge if it's broken into much smaller sort of entities that can develop more of a local identity, or redevelop or rediscover identities that were, expunged and repressed, that may have emerged in a stronger form, say in the 19th century, 18th century, but were consciously eradicated through the 20th century. That can only happen if it's a much smaller social and political entities. I look forward to our conversations next year. I look forward to Ukrainian victory. I look forward to the empire falling and the small role that hopefully we will play in that process.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for being a great friend of mine and a great friend of Ukraine. And I'm looking forward to all of the videos on your channel. It is a treasure, and I'm looking forward to your book.
Yes, and looking forward to sharing a beer in Kiev, Lviv, Odessa, Lutsk, wherever it is next year. This will definitely happen.
Or actually all of these cities.
Or all of them, yes. And Kharkiv as well. Hopefully, we'll do an event in Kharkiv for the book launch. Fingers crossed. That's one of the big plans for
Like
the year.
place books for me, please. I love Kharkiv.
Anna, happy Christmas, peace and joy. Thank you so much for all your support.
Щасливого Різдва.